This is the Satin Lounge. Michael Jackson's Thriller. Yeah, we're setting the mood appropriately for, what is it now? Halloween. I promised you all a fascinating show, and can I ask just some of you to maybe scooch over and allow some more room for some more company for Pillow Talk? I don't know, even after I introduce him and his projects, I may need somebody to hold me, and we're definitely sleeping with the lights on. Do you hear me? Our next guest is a freelance journalist originally from London, now living in Los Angeles. His articles have been published in over 90 magazines and newspapers, including the LA Times and LA Weekly. He is also a contributor to the BBC Radio and RTE Radio 1 in Ireland and blogs for bbcamerica.com. Tonight, he's here appropriately on Halloween to share with us his new book, Gourmet Ghosts. Okay, Satin Lounge, please help me welcome James Bartlett. So nice to have you here, James.
It's lovely to be here. Lovely to see you.
Oh, my goodness. We haven't seen each other in a while. We've done some work together in the past, and he's an amazing journalist. And your book is amazing. I just want you to know that. And I'm so excited to share it with Satin Lounge tonight. Listen, after we read this book and share this book, are we really going to have to sleep with the lights on? Is it like that?
Honestly, there are several stories in there definitely that really gave me quite a chill when I found out about them and did some research on them. There really are some quite frightening ones.
Oh my Lord! Well, before we get into some of those stories, what in the world was the catalyst for you writing this book? Why did you want to do this book, James?
Well, it's like a lot of people, you know. I'm interested in ghosts and ghost stories. You know, it's always something that you want to hear, and people love hearing stories being told. And as the book's largely about bars and restaurants that are haunted, I was appropriately enough in a bar having a drink, and I was talking to the people who were working there, and they mentioned, you know, the resident ghost story of the bar, and I listened, and I'm a journalist, so I tried to take some details down to remember them later. Yeah. And I thought I could possibly write a story about this. You know, I've never heard of this story before. People love these stories. Yeah. And I went home and I did some research on it, and I couldn't find anything about this story. Mm-hmm.
So maybe it was folklore. Maybe it was just...
Exactly. And that's the thing. Well, I thought that doesn't necessarily mean nothing ever happened there. That doesn't ever necessarily mean that it's all just totally made up. Mm-hmm. So then what I did was, which I love doing, I love going to the library. So I went down to the Central Library downtown. Okay. And I thought, right, I'll have a look in the archives of the newspapers. Mm-hmm. And look up to see if there's anything about the address of this building.
Wow, he is really resourceful. You were after this like an investigator.
Yeah, I just wanted, because I thought it was great, and I thought I want to find out, but I want to find out if there's anything to it. Okay. And so I looked up the address, and it just really rolled on from there. That particular one is in the book, and it turned out not to be one of the better stories, not one of the most frightening ones. But through that, I started talking to a couple of other people, and then people would just say, oh, but you've heard about here, and you've heard about that one, haven't you? And you've heard about that restaurant, haven't you? And you've heard what happened here. Yeah. And so I'd write them all down, and then I'd look them up online, then I'd read some books, then I'd go down to the Central Library and look in the LA Times archives and the Examiner archives to see if anything had happened that was any basis for the story that I had heard, if it had really happened. You know, people would say, oh, there was somebody who jumped off the 9th floor of the hotel. And then I would look in the LA Times to see if someone really had committed suicide and jumped off. And it turned out a lot of the times
it was accurate.
These stories were really, I guess, whether they'd heard them or not, but they really were based on something that had happened in real life.
So the supernatural part of this story comes in with them saying, what, somebody's haunting, whoever jumped off the 9th floor is now haunting the building?
Yeah, quite often it's that. Although what I also did was I also made sure that I didn't talk to people. I interviewed a lot of people who work in these bars and restaurants and the buildings, and I didn't go in and say, tell me a ghost story. Tell me about the ghost that's here. I would ask about the building and the architecture first, and then usually that's when it would come straight up, because a lot of places it was very common. Wow. People talked about it, and it usually just came up in conversation. And then I would go and look up and archive it and see if there was anything there, to see if there was a match. Oh, my goodness. And I would ask, you know, did anything really happen here? Is this true? And they go, well, I don't know. You know, that's what happened. We always see something on the 9th floor or the 8th floor or, you know, in the back room. And then I would look it up and it would turn out that something had happened there. And to me, that was a good enough connection for me to say, you know, that's a proper ghost story.
Wow. What fascinates you about the supernatural, ghosts or angels or demons or whatever's going on?
Yeah, I think it was certainly through this book, through talking to the people and about some of the stories, whether you believe or not, and whether you have a great belief in the afterlife or whatever you wish to call it yourself. I did sort of come to a conclusion based on, you know, some of the stories that I heard and some of the stuff that I found, that it does seem to me, it makes sense to me, that somebody who had been, you know, killed in a horrible way, or their life had been taken from them, or no one had found out how they died, or they had died, you know, without being identified, it would make sense to me that if there was any sort of spirit or whatever you wish to call it left, it might well be still there, you know, where they were last seen, or where they were, or where it happened, for whatever reason you wish to be there. But it made a lot of sense to me that I would read about these things, and you know, you'd read a tragic story, and then you'd find someone would tell you in the building or in the restaurant that it was still there, and I thought, yeah, I can believe that, I buy that.
Well, I think it's a correlation of who you are. I know who you are. You're a historian, and you've written so many stories about just the history of life, be it a story about a railroad train in a city, or all of these historical facts that sometimes are not really on our minds or on our consciousness anymore. You're such a curious person.
In a good way. In a nice way. The curious,
right,
nice.
The curious.
Not funny in a funny way, yeah.
So you say that there were a few stories that kind of really freaked you out, huh?
Yeah, I'll tell you one. It's
God. In my Satin Lounge, hold me. Okay, go ahead.
I'll tell you one. It was it's a building downtown. The biggest section of the book is downtown, obviously.
This is Los Angeles.
This is Los Angeles,
okay.
Yes. It's all Los Angeles, West Hollywood, Beverly Hills, West Side, Santa Monica. And so I did a lot of downtown. I really, really like downtown. You know, as I'm sure the listeners can tell, I'm not American. I'm from England originally. And so when I moved here about 8 or 10 years ago, you know, I went downtown straight away because that was where LA started. And of course, so many people are like, oh, we never go downtown. No one goes downtown. There's really nothing there. Well, I found that to be completely the opposite.
Well, now, I mean, back in the day.
Exactly. I mean, I come at just a good time for that. And so I did a lot of stuff. And like I say, I was down at the library a lot, was downtown as well. But there's a bookstore downtown. I'll give him a plug because I know the owner. He's a really nice guy. The Last Bookstore, it's called. And it's the bottom 2 floors, or 2 of the storage spaces within the Spring Arts Tower, which is also residential and businesses. So there's a bookstore, and it used to be a bank, and so even part of the bookstore is, you know, there's the vaults in there and stuff, and then underneath there's a nightclub which is actually in the vaults. That's pretty cool. And there's a cafe on the 9th floor, etc., etc. So it's a big building. Anyway, I talked to the guy who used to be the building manager about 10 or 15 years ago, when there was nothing there, when it was derelict, before the whole of downtown had been built up. And I said to him, you know, what was it like being in the building at night? Because you were there, you were the building manager, you lived there, but no one else was there. And he'd done some research on the building, and he told me a lot of history of the building. And I said, you know, did anything unusual or frightening happen? He told me several things, but the one that stuck with me was, he said, I was out, I was doing the rounds, I was on the 3rd floor. I was on the 3rd floor walking around, and I could hear, you know, jingling keys like people have in their pocket when they're bouncing up. And I could hear the sound of people, you know, trying doorknobs, you know, to see if they're open or closed, to check that they're locked. And he said I was completely terrified because I knew I was the only person in the building. And I also knew I was the only person who had keys, you know, to any of the doors. And so I wrote all that down, and I was like, oh, this would be a good entry. This is really interesting. So I went down to the library, looked up the building, did the research, and honestly, it's in the book because I reproduce a lot of the clippings from the newspapers. There was a story from that building, from the Spring Arts Tower, about the night watchman who had been doing his rounds one night, and he fell down the elevator shaft from the 3rd floor, which is exactly where the guy was when he heard the sound. And it was, you know, it was terrifying because the poor guy slit his throat on the cables.
Oh no!
Fell down all the way down to the basement where the bank was. All the people came into the bank next day, and because it was the freight elevator at the back of the building, which they didn't know was there because they never used it.
Right.
They could hear someone shouting for help.